Marcus's laugh echoed through our marble-floored kitchen, bouncing off the granite countertops he'd insisted on installing last year. A divorce? He took another puff of his cigar, deliberately blowing the smoke in my direction. That's cute, Rebecca. Really cute. I stood my ground, hands steady as I placed the papers on the kitchen island between us. 15 years of marriage had taught me exactly how this would play out. The mockery, the intimidation, the reminders of how helpless I was without him. But this time was different. This time, I was ready. I'm serious, Marcus, I said, keeping my voice level. I've already filed the paperwork. He stubbed out his cigar, still chuckling as he loosened his Italian silk tie. With what money, sweetheart? Last I checked, your name isn't on any of our accounts. The house, the cars, the credit cards, they're all in my name. I found a way, I replied simply. His amusement faltered for a split second before his face hardened. Let me explain something to you, Rebecca, he said, walking around the island until he was towering over me. You are nothing without me. Nothing. I took you from that pathetic teaching job and gave you all of this. He gestured around our expansive kitchen. The clothes you're wearing, the food you eat, the air you breathe, it all comes from me. I looked down at my designer dress, remembering how he'd suggested I wear it tonight. Everything in my life had to meet his approval, from my clothing to my friends to how I spent my time. For 15 years, I played the role of the perfect, submissive wife. If only he knew. You're right about one thing, I said, meeting his gaze. Everything about my life has been controlled by you. But that ends now. He grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to leave a mark. He was too smart for that, but enough to remind me of his strength. You're not going anywhere. You signed a prenup, remember? You'll leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing. I didn't pull away. Instead, I smiled, thinking about the USB drive hidden in my office, the offshore accounts he knew nothing about, and the paper trail I'd spent years meticulously documenting. We'll see about that, I said softly. His grip tightened slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not as helpless as you think. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my wrist. You should call your lawyer, Marcus. You're going to need him. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Marcus wasn't used to me standing up to him. In his world, I was the trophy wife he'd molded, beautiful, compliant, and most importantly, dependent on him for everything. He had no idea that for the past 5 years, I'd been systematically gathering evidence of his financial misconduct. Every business trip that was really a weekend with his mistress, every illegal transaction he thought he'd hidden, every shell company he created to evade taxes, I had documentation for all of it. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low and dangerous. A big one. I picked up my purse from the counter, checking my watch. 7:15 p.m. In exactly 12 hours, the FBI would be executing search warrants at his office and our home. By this time tomorrow, Marcus's carefully constructed empire would be crumbling. The mistake, I replied, heading for the door, was thinking you could control me forever. Where do you think you're going? He demanded. To my sister's, I said, though that wasn't entirely true. Sarah's house was just my first stop. Everything I truly cared about, documents, family photos, irreplaceable mementos, had already been moved to a secure location. If you walk out that door, he called after me, don't bother coming back. I turned to face him one last time, taking in the man I'd married 15 years ago. He still looked impressive in his tailored suit, his dark hair now touched with distinguished silver at the temples. But all I could see was the monster beneath the polished exterior. That's the plan, I said, and walked out. As I drove away from our gated community, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I wasn't always the meek, submissive wife Marcus thought he'd married. Before him, I'd been a high school English teacher with dreams of writing novels. I had friends, hobbies, a life of my own. But Marcus had slowly stripped all that away, replacing my independence with golden handcuffs and my confidence with carefully crafted insecurities. He'd isolated me from friends and family, controlled every aspect of my life through money, and convinced me I was nothing without him. What he didn't know was that his controlling nature had ultimately been his undoing. By monitoring every penny I spent, he'd made me hyper-aware of money, where it came from, where it went, and most importantly, how to track it. 5 years ago, I discovered his first affair by accident. A receipt for women's jewelry I hadn't received, charges at hotels when he was supposedly at business conferences. Instead of confronting him, I'd started digging deeper. What I found was far worse than infidelity. Marcus's real estate development company was a front for money laundering. He'd been stealing from investors, evading taxes, and running a complex web of financial fraud that would make Bernie Madoff proud. I pulled into Sarah's driveway, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. My sister opened the door before I could even knock, pulling me into a tight hug. "How did it go?" she asked, leading me inside. "Exactly as expected," I replied, sinking onto her couch. He laughed at me. Sarah handed me a glass of wine. "Did you tell him anything about?" "No," I shook my head. "He has no idea what's coming." My phone buzzed. A text from Agent Cooper at the FBI. "Everything in place for tomorrow. Teams will move at 7:30 a.m. I took a deep breath, thinking about the morning ahead. The simultaneous raids, the arrests, the inevitable media circus when they took Marcus away in handcuffs. Part of me felt guilty about destroying the life we built together. But then I remembered all the nights I cried myself to sleep, all the times he belittled me in front of others, all the ways he tried to break my spirit. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. "Are you sure you want to be there when it happens?" Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. I nodded. "I need to see it. I need him to know that I'm not the weak, helpless woman he thought I was." As I settled into Sarah's guest room that night, I thought about the USB drive that would seal Marcus's fate. Years of careful documentation, secret recordings, and financial records, all proving his crimes beyond any doubt. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that Marcus was probably sitting in his study, still convinced he had all the power. He had no idea what was coming. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. I was already awake at 6 a.m., sitting at Sarah's kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the minutes tick by. My phone buzzed with a message from Agent Cooper, "Teams in position. Are you ready?" I took a deep breath and replied, "Yes." By 7 a.m., Sarah and I were parked a discreet distance from my house, watching as unmarked FBI vehicles began taking up strategic positions around the neighborhood. Marcus's silver Mercedes was still in the driveway. He usually left for work at 7:45. "You don't have to watch this," Sarah said softly. "Yes, I do." I checked my watch again. 7:15 a.m. Right on schedule, Marcus emerged from the house in his usual power suit, briefcase in hand. He was probably still congratulating himself on how he'd handled my little rebellion last night. I could almost hear his voice. "She'll come crawling back. She always does." At exactly 7:30, everything happened at once. FBI agents emerged from their vehicles, converging on the house. I watched as Marcus froze halfway to his car, his briefcase slipping from his fingers as agents surrounded him. Even from this distance, I could see the shock on his face as they read him his rights. His head whipped around, scanning the street until his eyes landed on my car. Even through the tinted windows, I knew he could see me. I stepped out of the car, walking slowly toward the scene unfolding in our driveway. Agent Cooper met me halfway. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said formally, "we're executing search warrants both here and at your husband's office. The teams at his company headquarters are moving in simultaneously." I nodded, watching as Marcus was handcuffed and led toward a waiting vehicle. He was shouting now, demanding to speak to his lawyer, threatening everyone in sight. "Rebecca," he yelled when he saw me approaching. "What have you done?" I stopped a few feet away from him, maintaining my composure even as neighbors began emerging from their houses to watch the spectacle. "I did what you taught me, Marcus," I said calmly. "I took control." His face contorted with rage. "You stupid bitch," he spat. "You have no idea what you've done. I'll destroy you for this." "No," I replied, pulling the USB drive from my purse. "You won't. Everything's here, Marcus. Every illegal transaction, every shell company, every penny you've stolen. I've spent 5 years documenting all of it." The color drained from his face as understanding dawned. 5 years? Remember when you insisted I take that accounting course so I could understand our finances better? I smiled slightly. It worked. I understood them perfectly. Agent Cooper took the USB drive, nodding to his team. "Get him out of here." As they pushed Marcus toward the car, he kept looking back at me, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. "I gave you everything," he shouted. "You were nothing before me." "That's where you're wrong," I called after him. "I was everything before you. And now I am again." I watched as they drove away, sirens silent but lights flashing. Inside the house, agents were already executing their search warrant, though I knew they wouldn't find much. I'd already provided copies of everything they needed. Sarah appeared at my side, squeezing my hand. "You okay?" I nodded, watching as more FBI vehicles pulled up. The media wouldn't be far behind. A prominent real estate developer being arrested for fraud would be big news in our city. My phone was already buzzing with messages from friends and acquaintances. News traveled fast in our social circle, and Marcus's arrest would be the scandal of the year. Agent Cooper approached again, tablet in hand. "Mrs. Reynolds, we're finding even more than we expected. The fraud appears to extend beyond what you initially documented. Would you be willing to come down to the field office to make a formal statement?" "Of course," I replied, "but first there's something I need to do." I walked into the house, past the agents cataloging evidence, straight to Marcus's study. The hidden wall safe, which he thought I knew nothing about, was already open, its contents being carefully documented by FBI technicians. "Mrs. Reynolds," one of them called out. "We found these." He held up a stack of folders, records of accounts I hadn't known about, proving the fraud went even deeper than I discovered. I wasn't surprised. Marcus had always been thorough in his deceptions, both financial and personal. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. For 5 years, I played the role of the perfect wife while secretly building my case. I learned everything about his business operations, traced every illegal transaction, and documented every lie. While he was out with his mistresses, I was photographing documents and making copies of hard drives. The hardest part hadn't been gathering the evidence, it had been maintaining the facade. Smiling at dinner parties while knowing about his crimes. Playing the devoted wife while planning his downfall. Letting him believe he still controlled me while I systematically prepared to destroy him. I walked through the house one last time, remembering all the moments that had led to this day. The first time I discovered his affairs. The night I found documents proving his fraud. The morning I decided enough was enough. Agent Cooper found me in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Marcus had grabbed my wrist just yesterday. "The teams at his office found everything exactly where he said it would be," he reported. "The evidence is overwhelming. He's looking at 15 to 20 years, minimum." I nodded, picking up the divorce papers that still lay on the counter where I'd left them. "What about the assets?" "All frozen, pending investigation. But given your cooperation and the evidence you provided proving you weren't involved in the fraud, your attorney should be able to protect your interests." I smiled slightly, thinking of the separate accounts I carefully documented over the years, legitimate money that Marcus couldn't touch. He thought keeping me off the main accounts would leave me helpless. He never imagined I'd find other ways to ensure my financial independence. As we left the house, reporters were already gathering at the end of the driveway. Tomorrow, our pictures would be splashed across every news outlet in the city. Marcus in handcuffs, me walking calmly beside FBI agents. "Mrs. Reynolds," one reporter called out. "Did you know about your husband's illegal activities?" I paused, considering my response carefully. "No comment at this time," I said firmly, sliding into the back of Agent Cooper's car. As we drove away, I watched my house disappear in the rearview mirror. The massive gates, the manicured lawns, the perfectly coordinated decor. All of it had been a prison disguised as luxury. "Where to?" Agent Cooper asked. "The field office," I replied. "I have a lot more to tell you about Marcus Reynolds and his operations." A car pulled onto the highway, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The hardest part was over. Now came the aftermath, the investigations, the trial, the inevitable media circus. But for the first time in 15 years, I was truly free. Sarah called as we neared the FBI office. "It's all over the news," she reported. "They're calling it one of the biggest fraud cases in the city's history." "How bad is it?" "Pretty bad. They're estimating the fraud at over $50 million. His business partners are already distancing themselves, claiming they knew nothing about it." I wasn't surprised. Marcus had always surrounded himself with people as morally bankrupt as he was. Now they were scrambling to save themselves. As we pulled into the federal building's parking garage, I thought about what lay ahead. Months of legal proceedings, depositions, and court appearances. the dissolution of the life I'd known for 15 years. But I was ready. I had been for 5 years. Marcus had taught me well, just not the lessons he'd intended. He taught me to be patient, to keep records, to pay attention to details. He taught me that appearances could be deceiving, and that the most dangerous weapon was the one you never saw coming. Most importantly, he taught me that control was everything. And now, finally, I had it. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse, watching as Marcus was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, a far cry from his custom-made suits. The man who once commanded rooms with his presence now looked smaller, diminished. The sentencing hearing was a formality at this point. Marcus had finally accepted a plea deal after the mountain of evidence made fighting the charges futile. His high-priced lawyers had worked miracles just getting the sentence down to 12 years. I wasn't required to be there for the sentencing, but I needed to see it through. Needed him to see me one last time, sitting calmly in my own designer suit, one I'd bought with my own money. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Mr. Reynolds, you have pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything to say?" Marcus stood slowly, his chains clinking. For a moment, his eyes found mine in the gallery. The hatred there was palpable, but underneath it, I saw something else. Fear. "Your Honor," he began, his voice hoarse. "I accept responsibility for my actions. I let greed cloud my judgment. I've lost everything, my business, my reputation, my freedom." He paused, then added bitterly, "my wife." I kept my expression neutral, even as his words hit home. He still didn't get it, still saw himself as the victim, betrayed by the woman who should have stayed submissive and silent. The judge wasn't impressed. "Mr. Reynolds, you didn't lose anything. You threw it all away through your own criminal actions. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $47.3 million. The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom. As they led Marcus away, he tried one last time to catch my eye. I deliberately looked away, gathering my belongings. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. "Mrs. Reynolds, how do you feel about the sentence?" I paused, thinking carefully about my response. "Justice was served," I said simply. "That's all I have to say." Sarah was waiting in her car around the corner. "You okay?" she asked as I slid into the passenger seat. "Better than okay," I replied, feeling lighter than I had in years. We drove to the small house I'd bought with my settlement money, a modest but comfortable place that was completely mine. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but no golden handcuffs either. "Have you seen the latest?" Sarah asked, pulling out her phone. "They're calling you a hero. Apparently, other wives of corrupt executives are coming forward because of you." I shook my head, thinking about those women. I'm not a hero. I just refuse to be a victim anymore. That evening, as I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, I opened the letter that had arrived earlier that day. It was from my old high school, where I'd taught English before meeting Marcus. "Dear Mrs. Reynolds," it read. "We would be honored if you would consider speaking to our senior class about financial literacy and standing up to abuse." I smiled, remembering the young teacher I'd been, full of dreams and independence before Marcus had systematically stripped them away. That woman wasn't gone. She'd just been waiting, gathering strength, preparing for the right moment to emerge. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Cooper. "Thought you'd want to know. We're using your case as a training example for new agents. The way you documented everything was exceptional." I set down my wine glass, looking out at my small but beautiful garden. Tomorrow, I would start writing my book, not just about Marcus's crimes, but about the subtle way financial abuse traps women and how to fight back. The advance from the publisher was already in my account, not controlled by anyone else. The speaking invitations were piling up, and organizations wanted my insight on detecting financial fraud and empowering women. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Marcus's mother. She'd been trying to reach me since his arrest, alternating between blaming me and begging me to help him. I deleted it without reading it. That part of my life was over. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The designer clothes and perfect makeup Marcus had insisted upon were gone, replaced by comfortable pajamas and my natural face. I looked younger somehow, lighter. I thought about the USB drive that had started it all, 5 years of careful documentation, secret recordings, and financial records. It hadn't just been about gathering evidence. It had been about reclaiming my power, piece by piece, day by day. Marcus had always said I was nothing without him. He'd spent 15 years trying to make me believe it. But in the end, he'd been wrong about everything. I wasn't nothing without him. I was everything I'd always been: strong, capable, resilient. And now, finally, I was free. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the young women I'd be speaking to at my old high school. I knew exactly what I wanted to tell them. Never let anyone convince you that you're powerless. Never accept abuse disguised as love. And most importantly, never underestimate your own strength. Because sometimes, the perfect revenge isn't about destroying someone else, it's about reclaiming yourself. Marcus would spend the next 12 years in federal prison. But I wouldn't waste another moment thinking about him. I had a new life to build, a story to tell, and a future that was entirely my own. The next morning, I woke up early, made my coffee just the way I liked it, and sat down at my computer to begin writing my book. The working title was already clear in my mind: The Perfect Wife's Revenge. How I took back my life and brought down a criminal empire. As my fingers touched the keyboard, I smiled. This was just the beginning of my story, and this time, I was the one in control.